Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Esoteric Chit-Chat. This is Gwendolyn, and I'm here speaking with Julianne Victoria.
Hi, everyone.
And today we're talking about archetypes. So I'm going to just read a definition of what an archetype is. It is an original that has been imitated. It is a recurrent symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology. And another definition is that it's a very typical example of a certain person or thing. So some synonyms are quintessence, essence, representative, model, embodiment, prototype, stereotype, and more. So, Julie, do you have any comments about archetypes or things that you'd like to share before we launch into discussing some of the different ones?
Yeah, so I want to expand on sort of the archetype definition, maybe more on a psychological sense. Some of you who are listening may know that I have taken the Carolyn Mace Archetype Consulting course, which really goes into kind of the psychology of it. And during that course, she pointed out Carl Jung's view of archetypes are that archetypes, they can be comprised of psychological patterns of roles and situations in our lives. It's like our personal unconscious. Archetypes are personal, but they're also collective. And so we have our personal, each individual has our own archetypes. But there's also collective archetypes, which are impersonal, that are also in all individuals. So the collective archetypes can become personalized in our own psyche. So it gets very psychological. And kind of branching off on that, the language of archetypes is very symbolic, and it's a symbolic language of the universe. So it can really get into deep, deep layers within our psyches, and also through that, understanding the universe or the collective unconscious from there.
Absolutely. I love that you mentioned Carl Jung, because I think that he was one of the pioneers. In fact, I think he was one of the first introducers of the term archetype in I believe it was 1919 that he introduced that to the common vocabulary. And I'm going to read something by him as well here. It's a quote that he has about archetypes, and it says, "The symbols of the self arise in the depths of the body, and they express its materiality every bit as much as the structure of the perceiving consciousness. The symbol is thus a living body, corpus et anima." And I think that's really true, just like what you had just said, Julianne, is that there's the collective, sort of like the unformed or the very form of the thing, like the Greeks call the eidos, the structure, and then there is the embodiments of it. So I think it's fascinating how it can be both collective and personal at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to point out that when we talk about archetypes on the personal level, that understanding your own archetypes, especially your core archetypes or archetypes you're dealing with within you at a given point in time, they're all meant to help you kind of grow or enhance who you are. They serve a purpose for our personal growth. But on that note, as a person, you can grow and mature. The archetypes are the archetypes. They themselves don't mature. They help you through transitions through different phases of your life. Not always smooth transition, but as understanding that archetype within you, whether it's completely personal or the more universal archetype, helps you mature and grow as a person.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads me to something else that maybe I can ask you to elaborate on, Julianne, and that is that in each archetype there are sort of the shadow sides of it or the lower sides of it, and then the higher or triumphant sides. Like, for example, I've seen things talked about as like the victim is the low side that we can all inhabit, or someone who transcends that. The high side of the victim is saving oneself or becoming your own savior. Or so could you talk a little bit about that and how you see the lower sides and the higher sides, or the strengths or weaknesses of different archetypes?
Yeah, so each archetype in itself has both a higher, lower, or you could say a light and dark attribute. So your example, the victim. So the victim, you could just say, oh, victim sounds bad. That's a bad archetype. But the victim archetype itself has both a light and a shadow attribute. And so I'm actually looking at the Carolyn Mace card here for the victim, and I'm just going to read it out for you guys. The light attribute of the victim prevents you from letting yourself be victimized or victimizing others. So there's a positive side. Mm-hmm. The shadow attribute, or what you could say is the negative side, is playing the victim for positive feedback in the form of pity, inability to maintain personal boundaries. So victim itself isn't good or bad. It is an archetype that has both light and shadow, or good and bad attributes. And it's when we understand the victim within ourselves, for example, and according to Carolyn Mace, victim is one of the 4 core archetypes that everybody has. We learn to use the shadow attribute to help us see the light attribute. And hopefully we make the choice to live the lighter attribute through ourselves. So in contrast, I pulled out the rescuer archetype, which is sort of like, if you thought a victim is all bad, you would think, oh, the rescuer is all good. But for example, the rescuer itself also has a light and a shadow attribute, as all archetypes do. The light attribute of the rescuer provides strength and support to others in crisis, acts out of love with no expectation of reward. And the shadow attribute assumes that the rescued will reciprocate, keeps the rescued one needy. So do keep in mind that every archetype is a whole archetype in itself with both light and shadow attributes. And just to add to that, the 4 core archetypes, according to Carolyn Mace, are the victim, the prostitute, the saboteur, and the child. And at first, when, if you haven't studied this, you don't know anything about it, you might think, oh my gosh, those all sound really bad except for the child, right? And there's many manifestations of the child archetype. But I'll just read these 2 out for you since I read the victim. The saboteur, the light attribute, highlights your fear of self-empowerment and the changes it would bring into your life. And the shadow attribute induces self-destructive behavior or the desire to undermine others. So again, the shadow, awareness of the shadow type or the shadow attribute within the saboteur archetype or any archetype can help you see its opposite basically, and see the light attribute so you can choose that. Now the prostitute, the light attribute, accentuates the challenge of surviving without negotiating the power of your spirit. The shadow attribute places material considerations and security above self-empowerment. So again, it's like, once you're aware of the shadow, do you let that to continue to control you, or do you use the shadow to help you see the light attribute and become more empowered?
Yes, those are all core archetypes that we each have within us, and we will have different representations or manifestations of them dependent upon where we're at, or our development, or our recognition. And I think maybe we should mention, I love that you brought up Carolyn Mace because she's such a master in this field. And if people aren't familiar with her work, she's one of the people who, I believe on her website, she lists just hundreds of different archetypes. So it's an interesting exercise to go through and see which ones you identify with, and then see what their strengths and weaknesses are within each one of them, because you can then consciously take on, if you recognize something in yourself, you can consciously develop that and take on the stronger aspects of that, and recognize any shadow aspects or weaknesses that come with it.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to point out, if any of you listening out there, you go and try to figure out some of your own personal archetypes, is that one thing that's stressed is that your archetypes are not necessarily your personality. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's hard to find the difference between, is this my personality, or is this an archetypal behavior within me that I need to understand? So it can get a little tricky, because I remember about 12 years ago when I first read Sacred Contracts, and there's all the archetypes in the back. And when I took this course about 1.5 years ago, I went back to my book and I looked at the archetypes I had picked out for me at that point in time. And they were totally different from the ones that I actually discovered when I took the course. But the ones I had picked out 12 years ago were more personality traits and things I did in my physical life. Like I had picked the athlete archetype, but that was more of a personality thing I did rather than a core piece of who I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It can be tricky. It can take a while to figure it out, but it can be quite fascinating once you really start to dig deep within yourself with the archetypes.
Absolutely. And I mean, it kind of goes into that, the structural thing where an archetype will always have outward manifestations, but an outward manifestation isn't always something that we pick up, isn't necessarily one of our core foundational structures.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And so speaking of core foundational structures, I may just talk a little bit about this wheel here. There's 12, Carl Jung developed 12 basic archetypes. There's, again, hundreds or even thousands of them. There's no way we could fit them all on this page, but he developed 12 of them that are based on 4 basic human needs. And we even see that applied with marketing strategies these days. He introduced these, and then Joseph Campbell in 1949 showed that archetypes were not only culture specific, but that they crossed cultures, so that you could find examples of these things even in varied cultures, which is kind of it shows the commonality and the power of them.
Yeah, the universalness of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go through quickly with these 4 needs, and then the each of the 3 archetypes that correspond to them, and I might just read a little bit about each one. So, and then Julianne too, if you want to contribute to that, or as we go, I'm just gonna like go through this wheel.
Okay, well, actually, while you do that, I'm going to see if there's, archetype cards that match up, and
oh, fantastic!
The 2 different teachers, Jung and Carolyn Mace, how the archetypes are described. Basically.
Love it.
Okay.
More information, the better.
Yeah.
So, the term archetype has its origins in ancient Greek. I'm reading something from something written by Carl Golden.
Mm-hmm.
And it says the root words are archaean, which means original or old, and typos, which means pattern, model, or type. Combined meaning is original pattern, of which all other similar persons, objects, or concepts are derived, copied, modeled, or emulated. So one of the archetypes is the innocent. Mm-hmm. So that's up here at the top on this wheel. These aren't in any particular order, by the way. These are just organized by the 4 core principal needs, human needs, which is the need for structure and stability, the need for impact or making a mark on the world, the need for connection, and then the need or yearning for paradise or participating in paradise. So the innocent has to do with connection to paradise. Their motto is free to be you and me. Their core desire is to be in paradise and enjoy being there. It's like simplicity. Mm-hmm. The goal is to be happy. Their greatest fear is to be punished for doing something bad or wrong. Their weakness is boring for all their naive innocence. So they're kind of like the child in that way, the innocence that we think of with a child. Their talent is faith and optimism. And then other terms for the innocent are the naive, the mystic, the saint, the romantic, the traditionalist, the utopian, or the dreamer. So those are all related.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then shall I just go around the wheel, or should we look at particular ones, or
whatever jumps out at you, whatever you feel drawn to talk about?
The one that I'm really interested in right now is the outlaw. I think that's such a fascinating and fun and fun archetype because someone has, I've heard someone define it as the liberator, but it also, that's sort of like a high side of it. I'm not sure if there's a card there for this one or not, but it has to do with liberating and breaking rules for the purpose of liberation. But it can also take on, the rebel, the trickster, the villain. So that's one. I've been interested in the outlaw concept because of there's that Greek myth of Prometheus who brings information to humans, but he has to sort of steal the fire and bring it. He has to break the law and be the outlaw in order to bring the new understanding. So that's kind of been a fun one that I've been thinking about recently.
It's interesting because for outlaw with the cards here, I picked up both rebel and judge.
Ooh, interesting.
Because, each archetype has its light and shadow aspects. So the rebel here, the light attribute is challenges authority to affect social change, rejects spiritual systems that do not serve inner needs. And the shadow attribute of the rebel rejects legitimate authority out of anger, rebels out of peer pressure or fashion. And then the judge, I picked the judge because he has a shadow attribute, right? So the light attribute of the judge is balancing justice and compassion, managing the fair distribution of power. But his shadow attribute is offering only destructive criticism, misusing business, legal, or criminal authority. And the shadow attribute just makes me kind of think of like Robin Hood, and Prometheus, like doing something wrong, but and being in like a position of power, but kind of doing something illegal at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to look at, all the things that can encompass within an archetype. Like I show a weakness of the rebel or the outlaw as being like crossing over to the dark side or crime, where they're actually, they're disrupting and destroying or shocking. That could be done for good or for evil, or that can be done for creative, constructive things or for destructive things. So it's interesting how it can encompass both.
Yeah, and I have the thief archetype card here. The light attribute sheds light on the potential wealth within that can never be stolen. The shadow attribute is stealing money, creative ideas, affection, or other powers you think you lack.
That's really interesting. Yeah, generally when we're trying to get something from the outside, it's because we feel a lack from the inside. That's
right.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
What else should we look at?
Let's look at Jester.
Jester. Okay. That's a classic. We see that in the tarot too.
Oh yeah, the Fool card or the Magician. They both can represent the Jester depending on how it's read.
Interesting too that they're 0 and 1. So unformed and formed, they're kind of like they dance between the two of those things.
Oh, and there's a Magician down here too. Interesting. Jester and Magician. It'd be interesting do you have?
I do. Yeah. In fact, one of the things for Jester or Fool was about enjoying the moment and having fun. It's connection. Like some representatives of that would be like Mark Twain or comedians. And so their motto is you only live once. Their core desire is to live in the moment with full enjoyment. Their goal is to have a great time and lighten up the world. Their greatest fear is being bored or boring others. Their strategy is to play, make jokes, be funny. Their weakness is frivolity, wasting time. And then they're also known as like the fool, the trickster, the joker, the practical joker, the comedian, the class clown, all of that. So, and also I want to mention with Jester or Fool is that they had a great talent in the royal court where they were making jokes, making things light and comedic all the time, that they could actually reveal truths that no one else could point to. And we see this in comedy today where comedians can really shine a light on something that's very true, but they can do it in a safe way because it's through comedy. They can say the most outrageous things,
if you make someone laugh,
yeah,
no, it's not like you're insulting them.
Right. So it's funny. And then Magician, I believe the Magician has to do with making things happen. So understanding the fundamental laws of the universe. The their goal is to make dreams come true, bring dreams into reality. Their greatest fear is unintended negative consequences. So we can see that as like, magic gone wrong. Strategy is to develop a vision and live by it. Their weakness is that they can become manipulative. Their talent is finding win-win solutions. And the magician is also known as the visionary, the catalyst, the inventor, the charismatic leader, the shaman, the healer, or the medicine man. So that's what I have for...
That encompasses quite a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the archetype cards, there's both a fool and a trickster. And I originally pulled out trickster to talk about with jester, and then I realized there's also a fool card. So the light attribute of the fool, fearlessly revealing emotion, helping people laugh at absurdity and hypocrisy, kind of like we were discussing. And the shadow attribute is using humor to wound rather than liberate. Denial of your emotional truth. And then the trickster, the light attribute, transcending convention, stuffiness, and predictable behavior. And the shadow attribute is manipulating others through duplicity.
Interesting.
To me, that's definitely like the shadow side, or like in tarot, the reversal of the magician card. It's very tricky at times, depending on the reading. But then as you were reading about the magician, I pulled out the visionary card, as well as the artist. So the visionary, the light attribute, is the capacity to envision what is not yet conceivable to others, willingness to proclaim a vision without regard for personal gain. And the shadow attribute is selling insights to the highest bidder, compromising your vision to make it more acceptable. So this is more of a spiritual visionary than, I think, a magician kind of archetype. But the artist, because I always think magicians can create things, right? Through their imagination and their inspiration. The light attribute is expressing a dimension of life that is just beyond the five senses, inspiring others to see life symbolically. And the shadow attribute is using talent as an excuse to mistreat others. So this is kind of the trickster magician quality. And posing as the starving artist to elicit pity.
Yeah, sometimes they can, I think sometimes they can overlap, or they can be combinations of one another, like I've seen
jester and magician, and
yes, exactly. Jester and magician can definitely work in tandem.
For example, like caregiver archetype. That could be a mother archetype. It could be a healer archetype. It could be some sort of leader type archetype, a servant type archetype as well. So there's lots of overlap, and that can sometimes make it a little challenging to figure out your own archetypes. But it is quite fascinating as you dig deeper, because there's layers and layers and layers.
Yeah, and the fact that they each have different aspects, like when you talked about the trickster, it made me think of, a lot of movies use these archetypes. We can identify the hero, we can identify the villain. When we talk about trickster, I think of, someone like a Han Solo kind of guy, where he kind of is on this outlaw role, but he uses his wits. And he uses humor like the jester or the fool, but he kind of goes back and forth. Or I think of like Clint Eastwood's Fistful of Dollars character, where they've got this outlaw trickster, they're kind of like operating for their own selves, which could be like high side and low side. So it's funny how different ones can take on different characteristics depending upon how they're functioning.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, like watching movies and trying to figure out which archetype or which dominant archetype a character is supposed to be embodying can be a really fun challenge and a good way to learn the archetypes.
Absolutely.
Like you said, there's like most movies, there's a hero and there's, you could say, an outlaw or the troublemaker, the jester, there's often the lover.
Yep.
There's the sage, there's the wise person who says you should do this and they don't listen to them.
Exactly.
You can play even just like TV shows, and plots are whether consciously by the writers and the directors or unconsciously, because archetypes are unconscious within all of us, that the archetypes are there.
Yeah, in fact, I saw some sort of chart that showed that with all these different movies like Harry Potter, Star Wars, Star Trek, and they list all the archetypes, and then they showed like who played that role in that movie. I'll try to link to that in the description if I can find that chart, because it's so there.
Yes, it's. I mean, archetypes are everywhere. They're all around us, and
Mm-hmm.
if any listening are interested in digging deeper, you really start to see that it really is everywhere. And even, you can see movies, TV shows as sort of like modern version of mythological stories. But if you look at ancient mythology from any culture, kind of like Joseph Campbell did, you can start to see the archetype patterns. So it's a great way to study and learn them. So then you can study and learn them within yourself.
That's a great thing to, I think we could even wrap up on that. I think it's funny you just mentioned the Greeks, because it shows how ancient this stuff is. I mean, whether it's the stories of the Greek gods or whether it's like a modern blockbuster film, it's all similar stories. It's all similar patterns and archetypes. And it's really cool to be able to see those at play and understand ourselves better through that lens.
Yeah. And actually, as you were saying that, I could see how, studying archetypes for the individual can really help you feel like you are connected to the whole.
Absolutely.
These archetypes, they're universal. They're within everyone. They're within all societies. And yeah, like I just suddenly was thinking, I feel really connected to everyone out there now that I'm looking into this more deeply again.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's something that we all sort of retain within us. It's something that we all can connect to and relate to. There's a reason why we have that emotional draw to characters, because they evoke something within us. It's like us understanding our lives through them.
And not just the characters that we're positively drawn to.
Oh, right.
But I would say the characters that you really dislike.
Mm-hmm. Could be shadow aspects of ourselves.
Shadow aspects of ourselves that maybe you should take a deeper look at that and learn to like, because it can actually be, if you get the shadow aspect if you shed light on the shadow aspect, it can really be a useful tool, as you can see with the cards that I read. That archetype can be a positive thing, not something you hate and despise that makes you hate characters in movies and TV shows and stories.
Yeah, something that you can integrate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, very cool, Julianne. I always love talking with you because you have such a rich depth of knowledge of this stuff, and I know it's a subject we both enjoy tremendously.
Yeah, and I love that we can bring our own backgrounds together and talk about the same thing, basically.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully hopefully folks out there got something out of this, or, if you're interested in learning about archetypes, I'll try to put some links to the Carolyn Mace and maybe any other resources that we come across so that you can dig a little further and see what archetypes you relate to.
And I'll also put in the description the link. For a while, a little over a year ago, I was doing daily insights, and I went through basically all the archetype cards. So I'll link to that playlist on my YouTube channel.
Yes, do check that out. Do check that out. Okay, Julianne, well, always a pleasure to speak with you.
For me too, and thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.